Washington, D.C. What would you do if the very institution you worked for was built on injustice? 32-year-old Jordan Carter had spent years climbing the ranks of the prestigious firm Langston and Beck. As the only black senior associate, he worked twice as hard to earn his place. He had stayed late, taken on impossible cases, and built a reputation as a brilliant legal mind. He had done everything they asked of him, proving himself again and again in a firm that barely acknowledged his presence beyond what he could bring to the table. But when he was assigned to defend a young black man, Marcus Hayes, falsely accused of robbery, something felt wrong. The prosecution had flimsy evidence, yet the firm pressured Jordan to take a plea deal instead of fighting. "We don't waste resources on unwinnable cases," his supervisor had said. Jordan clenched his jaw. Unwinnable? The case was stacked with inconsistencies, contradictions, and racial bias. The evidence was circumstantial at best. No clear fingerprints, no surveillance footage placing Marcus at the scene, and the only witness was a store owner with a history of racially profiling customers. So, why weren't they fighting for Marcus? Jordan sat at his desk, staring at the case files. He flipped through the documents, each one making him angrier. If he took the easy route and pushed Marcus into a plea deal, it meant a young man would have a record for something he didn't do. It meant another black life reduced to a statistic in a system designed to crush them. It wasn't just another case. It felt personal. Digging deeper, Jordan requested access to the firm's archived cases. He spent hours combing through files, looking for patterns, looking for a reason why this particular case was being handled so dismissively. Then he found it. Buried in the archives was a case from over 50 years ago. A black man wrongfully convicted of a crime he didn't commit. The name on the file made Jordan's blood run cold. It was his grandfather. Decades ago, Langston and Beck had represented his grandfather in a case eerily similar to Marcus's. The same tactics, the same pressure to accept a plea deal, the same indifference to justice. His grandfather had spent years behind bars for a crime he didn't commit, his life derailed by a justice system that never saw him as innocent in the first place. Jordan sat back in his chair, stunned. This wasn't just a fight for Marcus. This was a fight for his own family's history. He closed the file, his decision made. He wasn't going to take the easy way out. He wasn't going to let Marcus become another name on a list of wrongful convictions. Because some battles aren't just about justice, they're about legacy. Jordan combed through old case files, searching for patterns. The deeper he looked, the more disturbing the truth became. What he found made his stomach turn. Countless cases of black defendants being pressured into false guilty pleas. Some were minor offenses, others were serious charges with little to no evidence. Yet they all had one thing in common. They were handled by Langston and Beck. His own grandfather, Elijah Carter, had been framed for theft in 1965. Jordan flipped through the documents, his hands trembling. The same legal tricks, the same racial bias, repeating through generations. Elijah had been sentenced by judges connected to Langston and Beck, the same firm Jordan worked for, the same firm that had let injustice fester for decades. "This isn't a coincidence," Jordan muttered. "This is systemic." But before he could bring it up, his mentor, Daniel Whitmore, pulled him aside. "Jordan, listen to me," Whitmore said in a hushed voice. "Some cases are better left in the past." Jordan frowned. "What does that mean? You knew about this." Whitmore sighed. "I know how the system works. I know what happens to lawyers who push too hard. And I know that you're not going to like what you find if you keep digging." Jordan's jaw tightened. "I don't have a choice." Whitmore placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Then be ready for a fight, because this firm protects its own. And if you challenge them, you won't just be risking your career, you'll be risking everything." Jordan sat back at his desk, staring at the documents spread before him. The weight of the past and present settled heavily on his shoulders. He ran his fingers over the faded ink of his grandfather's file, imagining the fear Elijah must have felt when he was sentenced for a crime he didn't commit. His heartbeat thundered in his ears as he read through more cases. Dozens, maybe hundreds of men like Marcus and Elijah, wronged by a system that was supposed to protect them. The patterns were undeniable. The tactics were too precise to be random. A knock on the door made him jump. Another senior associate stepped in, giving him a wary look. "You've been spending a lot of time in the archives," she noted. Jordan met her gaze without flinching. "Doing research." She hesitated. "You should be careful." The door closed before he could respond. Jordan inhaled deeply. He had a choice to make: turn a blind eye like so many before him, or take a stand. His fingers tightened around the file in front of him. He was no longer just defending a client. He was fighting for his family's name, and he wasn't backing down. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the benches. Law students scribbled notes, and high-profile attorneys from the most powerful firms in the country watched closely. Every eye was locked on Jordan Carter. The prosecution smirked, straightening their tie. "The evidence is clear. Marcus Hayes committed this crime. The witness testimony and circumstantial evidence all point to his guilt." Jordan stood, his voice steady but commanding. "No, it isn't. But I'll show you what is clear." He walked over to the evidence table and pulled out a stack of documents. This case isn't just about Marcus Hayes. It's about a pattern, a history, a system built on injustice, and I have the proof to show it. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The judge frowned, eyeing Jordan carefully. "Counselor, are you accusing your own firm of misconduct?" Jordan's pulse pounded in his ears, but he didn't hesitate. He turned and locked eyes with the senior partners of Langston and Beck, the very people who had tried to silence him. "Yes, Your Honor, and I have the records to prove it." The murmur in the courtroom grew louder. The opposing counsel shifted uncomfortably, their confidence suddenly wavering. Reporters leaned forward, pens scratching furiously against their notepads. Cameras clicked, capturing every second. Jordan stepped toward the judge's bench and handed over decades' worth of firm records, case files, and internal memos. These documents reveal a consistent pattern of wrongful convictions against black defendants, cases where the firm pressured innocent men into plea deals, buried key evidence, and manipulated the legal process to maintain their spotless record. The judge flipped through the files, his face darkening. The courtroom was so silent that even the faint rustling of paper sounded deafening. "This is a serious accusation, Counselor," the judge warned. Jordan nodded. "I understand, Your Honor, but I also understand that we cannot ignore the truth any longer. I will not let Marcus Hayes become another name lost in a corrupt system." The senior partners of Langston and Beck sat rigidly in their chairs, their expressions unreadable. But Jordan could see it, the flicker of panic in their eyes. They had spent decades controlling the courtroom, shaping narratives to their advantage. Now, the truth threatened to dismantle their carefully crafted empire. The opposing lawyer cleared their throat, attempting to regain control. This is nothing more than a desperate attempt to deflect from the facts of this case. We object to these allegations being introduced." "Objection overruled," the judge said firmly, silencing them. "These records demand a deeper investigation." A ripple of shock spread through the room. Jordan's heart pounded, but he stood tall. The case was no longer just about Marcus Hayes. It was about every person wronged by the firm, every injustice swept under the rug, every life destroyed by a system built to keep people like Marcus and Jordan powerless. He took a deep breath and looked toward Marcus, who sat beside him, eyes wide with hope for the first time since his arrest. Across the room, the senior partners whispered among themselves, their carefully maintained facade cracking under the weight of the evidence. The judge turned to the court clerk. "Prepare a motion for an immediate investigation into Langston and Beck." The opposing counsel's face paled. "Your Honor, surely—" The judge cut them off. "Enough. The integrity of our justice system is at stake. We will not turn a blind eye." Jordan's fingers tightened around the edges of his files. He had set something in motion that could not be undone. He had just turned the case into a war against corruption, and he wasn't backing down. The moment the legal world held its breath. Nobody expected what Jordan revealed next. The same racist strategies used against my client today were used against my grandfather 50 years ago. Jordan displayed the original trial records. Same prosecutors, same judges, same law firm. The jury exchanged nervous glances. The prosecution shifted uncomfortably. Some of the high-profile attorneys watching from the gallery leaned forward, their expressions darkening as they took in the implications. "This isn't justice," Jordan said. "This is history repeating itself." The senior partners of Langston and Beck turned pale. Their carefully constructed empire was unraveling in real time, exposed under the unforgiving light of truth. The judge cleared his throat, his expression unreadable. "This court will review all past convictions handled by this firm." The prosecution attempted to object, but the damage was done. The weight of decades of injustice was too much to ignore. The courtroom buzzed with urgency. Reporters scribbled notes furiously, cameras flashed, and whispers filled the air. "Your Honor, we must question the validity of these claims," the lead prosecutor stammered. "This is nothing but a dramatic tactic to distract from the case at hand." Jordan didn't flinch. He picked up another file and held it up. "This is the case of Elijah Carter, wrongfully convicted in 1965, sentenced by the same judge who oversaw a dozen other convictions of black men under dubious circumstances, all represented by Langston and Beck." The judge's eyes narrowed. "Continue, counselor." Jordan placed the file on the evidence table. "This isn't a coincidence. It's a pattern. It's a system that has preyed upon people who look like Marcus for generations. And the worst part, the people who let it happen are sitting in this very room." Gasps rippled through the audience. The senior partners at Langston and Beck sat motionless, but their tight grips on the arms of their chairs spoke volumes. The judge turned to the court clerk. "I want a full review of all wrongful convictions tied to this firm, effective immediately." The murmurs grew louder. Journalists whispered into their microphones, reporting the moment in real time. Legal analysts exchanged glances, already predicting the fallout this case would bring. Marcus Hayes, the man who had spent months fearing for his future, sat in stunned silence. Hope flickered in his eyes for the first time since his arrest. His mother, seated behind him, wiped away tears as she clutched her hands together. Jordan exhaled, steadying himself. He had known this battle would be difficult. He had known speaking out could destroy his career. But as he looked at Marcus, then at the jury, He knew he had done what was right. The judge finally spoke. This case is no longer just about Marcus Hayes. It is about ensuring that our justice system serves all people equally, and that starts today. The courtroom erupted. Reporters raced to get their stories out. Camera flashes lit up the room as Jordan stood firm at the defense table, his hands gripping the edges. Jordan hadn't just defended his client. He had started a revolution. And there was no turning back now, the moment power slipped from the hands of the corrupt. One lie, one mistake, and a legal empire crumbling. The media exploded. Headlines dominated every major news outlet. Top law firm accused of racial bias in historic cases. Langston and Beck scrambled to contain the damage, but it was too late. The State Bar Association launched a formal investigation. Former clients, many of whom had been wrongfully convicted, came forward with their own harrowing stories. Protests erupted outside the firm's headquarters, calling for justice and accountability. The once prestigious firm now found itself drowning in controversy. Inside the boardroom, the senior partners argued, their once unshakable confidence cracking under the weight of the scandal. The walls that had sheltered corruption for decades now felt like a prison. This firm was built on legacy. The senior partner sneered at Jordan, and you just burned it to the ground. Jordan folded his arms. Number Soy just gave it the justice it always lacked. The firm's biggest corporate clients pulled out, unwilling to be associated with an institution built on corruption. Lawsuits piled up. One by one, the firm's most powerful figures resigned in disgrace. Offices were emptied. Employees whispered in the hallways, wondering if they'd still have jobs by the end of the month. As Jordan walked past his old office, he saw boxes being packed, desks being cleared. The empire he had once been so desperate to be part of had become nothing more than a crumbling monument to greed and injustice. But he wasn't done yet. The Bar Association's review expanded. Other firms were scrutinized, old cases reopened. Judges with ties to Langston and Beck were questioned about their rulings. The ripple effect was undeniable. What had started with Marcus Hayes's case had turned into something much bigger. Jordan knew he had made enemies, powerful ones. But as he looked out at the protesters demanding reform, at the families of those wrongfully convicted finally being heard, he knew he had done the right thing. For years, Langston and Beck had been untouchable. Now, it was just another cautionary tale. As Jordan watched from a distance, he knew this was only the beginning. The fight for justice wasn't over. But for the first time, the system was finally being forced to listen. Jordan had taken on giants and won. Justice for the past, hope for the future. One act of bravery changed everything. Marcus Hayes was acquitted. His wrongful arrest exposed the corruption of the system. The case that started as a single fight had turned into a movement, a reckoning for the legal world. Langston and Beck shut down, but Jordan wasn't done yet. He founded a new law firm, Carter Justice and Associates. This firm, he announced, will fight for the wrongly accused. No exceptions, no compromises. Justice belongs to everyone. The opening day was packed. Lawyers, activists, and families of the wrongfully convicted stood in support of the firm's mission. Reporters documented every moment, recognizing that history was being made. The energy in the room was electric, filled with the hope of people who had spent years waiting for justice that never came. At the grand opening, Jordan stood beside a framed picture of his grandfather, Elijah Carter, the man who had been wrongfully convicted, whose life had been stolen by an unjust system. But his legacy wouldn't be one of defeat. it would be one of change. Elijah Carter never got justice, Jordan said, his voice steady, but his name will stand for it now. A round of applause erupted. Some clapped in admiration, others wiped away tears. A woman in the crowd stepped forward. "My brother was one of the people Langston and Beck wrongfully convicted," she said. "For years, we thought no one would listen. But today, I believe change is possible." Jordan reached out and squeezed her hand. "It is, and we'll make sure of it." He glanced at the sign above his office. Carter, Justice and Associates. A name that, from this day forward, would symbolize fairness, equality, and the relentless pursuit of justice. The first cases came in almost immediately. Men and women who had been silenced by a broken system now had a voice. Carter Justice and Associates took them all, whether they were high profile or completely unknown. Jordan worked tirelessly, ensuring that no one would be ignored. His team grew. Young lawyers, inspired by his fight, joined the firm. Some had once worked for Langston and Beck, but left after witnessing the corruption firsthand. Others were fresh out of law school, eager to make a difference. Together, they formed something new, something that couldn't be bought, bribed, or silenced. Months passed, and Jordan's firm became more than just a law practice. It became a movement. Law schools invited him to speak about justice reform. Politicians sought his input on policies aimed at dismantling systemic racism in the courts. And every morning, when he walked into his office, he touched the frame of his grandfather's picture. Because sometimes justice takes generations to achieve, and Jordan was just getting started. A moment that shook the legal world. A hero deserves more than just a thank you. Jordan's story went viral, inspiring young lawyers everywhere. His fight for justice ignited discussions in law schools, courtrooms, and political arenas. Law schools started teaching about systemic bias in their ethics courses, using his case as a landmark example of fighting against legal corruption. Universities invited him to speak, and his work was cited in legal reform discussions across the nation. Former wrongful convictions were overturned because of his work. Families who had once lost hope finally saw justice being served. Judges and prosecutors were forced to reconsider the way cases were handled. The impact was undeniable. Public defenders found renewed confidence to challenge systemic injustice, citing Jordan's victory as a turning point. And Jordan? He wasn't done fighting yet. "What's next for you?" a reporter asked him outside the courthouse, microphone extended. Jordan smiled, adjusting his tie. "Making sure no one else has to fight the way my grandfather did." He walked into his new office at Carter Justice and Associates, ready for the battles ahead. The firm had become more than just a law practice. It was a beacon for those who had been ignored and silenced by the system for too long. Every day, letters poured in from people desperate for representation. Some had been fighting for years, waiting for someone like Jordan to believe in their case. A young law student approached him later that day. "I want to be like you," she said. "I want to fight for justice." Jordan handed her a book on civil rights law. "Then start here, read, learn, and when you're ready, come back. We'll need people like you." At the end of the day, he stood in his office, staring at the framed photo of Elijah Carter. "We did it," he whispered. His grandfather's legacy had been restored, not as a victim of injustice, but as the foundation for change. Months later, Jordan found himself testifying before Congress on racial bias in the judicial system. His work had led to legislative proposals that aimed to reform the appeals process and eliminate prosecutorial misconduct. change wasn't just happening, it was being written into law. His firm expanded. More young attorneys joined his cause. Carter Justice and Associates became a national name, a force that refused to be intimidated. And Jordan, once a lawyer fighting for one man's freedom, became a symbol of something bigger, a movement that could not be ignored. Jordan had won his case that day, but in the end, he had rewritten the future of justice